Nobody tells you how long silence has to stretch before it starts to change shape, before it stops being something the avoidant chose and starts being something they feel the weight of, before the absence of you, which they orchestrated, which they designed, which they convinced themselves was what they needed, becomes something they have to actually live inside rather than simply declare. That moment exists. It arrives on a specific kind of timeline. And if you're somewhere in the middle of no contact right now, somewhere in the part where the days blur together and you can't quite tell if you're healing or just waiting, this is what's happening on their side of the silence. There are stages to avoidant regret. They don't look like what you'd expect. They don't come with apologies at their peak. They don't announce themselves. They move through the avoidant in the same quiet, lateral way that avoidants tend to experience everything that threatens their emotional defenses. Slowly, obliquely, through the body, before the mind, until what started as relief becomes something they can no longer ignore. Understanding these stages is not about building hope that they'll come back. It's not about managing the timeline. It's about seeing clearly what actually happens in someone with avoidant attachment when the person they retreated from disappears entirely. When the certainty of your availability, which they may have never consciously appreciated while it was there, is replaced by the real texture of your absence. The first stage is relief, and it's real. When an avoidant creates distance, whether through a gradual fade, a sudden pullback, or an abrupt ending, there is an initial exhale inside them. The pressure of intimacy lifts. The anxiety that built with closeness begins to recede. The nervous system, which had been in a kind of sustained low-grade alarm the closer things got, quiets. For a period that varies from days to weeks, the avoidant experiences something that genuinely feels like freedom. This is the stage that breaks the people who love them, because it's real. The avoidant really does feel better at first. The distance really does bring relief. And if you're watching from the outside, it can feel like evidence that they never cared. Like the relationship you thought mattered is simply dissolving into their life without leaving a mark. But here's what the relief stage actually is. It's the body's response to the removal of a trigger. The avoidant isn't feeling better because the relationship wasn't meaningful. They're feeling better because closeness itself, regardless of with whom, activates a threat response in their nervous system. The relief is not about you specifically. It's about the specific terror of vulnerability, which they just removed themselves from. That terror is old. Older than you. Older than this relationship. It was installed in them long before they had the language to understand it, in moments where being emotionally visible led to pain. Their system learned that close equals dangerous, and it stored that equation somewhere deeper than logic can reach. So when they pull away, the relief is genuine. The nervous system is just doing what it was taught to do, treating the end of closeness as the end of threat. The relief stage always has a ceiling. Here's why. The avoidant didn't just lose the anxiety of intimacy, they also lost the reward, the warmth, the person who thought about them, the presence that made the ordinary texture of daily life feel different. When they chose distance, they chose the absence of discomfort. But the absence of discomfort is not the same as the presence of peace. And eventually, the space where you were stops being quiet and starts being empty. There's a difference between those two things that the avoidant will learn in the months after the withdrawal. Quiet is chosen. Empty is felt. Quiet is what you have when the anxiety recedes. Empty is what's left when something that actually mattered is no longer there. The second stage is the distractions. Avoidants are remarkably adept at filling space. They double down on independence in this phase. They throw themselves into work, into social connection with less emotionally demanding people, into hobbies, into the comforting predictability of routine. There's nothing wrong with any of those things on their surface, but underneath the activity, there's a function being served. The function is avoidance of what's in the space you left. This stage can last a long time. The avoidant has spent years perfecting the art of not sitting with discomfort. They know exactly where to put their attention to avoid the places that ache. They are, in many ways, extraordinarily efficient at this particular form of self-protection. It's one of the most sophisticated and exhausting ways of managing interior pain that exists. But the body keeps score, the nervous system keeps accounts. And something that was real, the connection between two people, the particular texture of what you had, doesn't simply dissolve because one person decided to stop looking at it. It exists in the nervous system as a felt memory. It exists in the patterns of expectation that were organized around your presence. It exists in the quiet moments when there's nothing external to orient toward and the interior is simply there, holding what it holds. The third stage is when the distractions start to cost more. There is a specific kind of restlessness that arrives somewhere between the first weeks and the first months. A quality of dissatisfaction that wasn't there during the initial relief. Not dramatic grief. Not the acute pain of the person who was left. Something more like chronic flatness. A persistent sense that the things that are supposed to provide meaning are providing less of it than they should. This is harder to name and therefore harder to address. The avoidant doesn't sit down and say, "I miss them." They're more likely to say nothing at all, but to move through their days with the quality of going through motions that they can't quite explain. The satisfaction that used to come from independence, from solitude, from the freedom they retreated to. It's still there, technically. The structural conditions of their preferred life are intact, but something inside the life has shifted in tone. What's happening physiologically is significant. Genuine human connection, the kind that existed between you, has neurological effects. It changes dopamine patterns, influences oxytocin availability, alters the baseline feeling of being known and mattering to someone. When that connection is severed, the system that was oriented toward it undergoes a kind of recalibration. The avoidant is not immune to this process simply because they initiated the distance. The body doesn't reward you for the withdrawal. It registers the loss the same way it registers all losses, with a quiet, persistent ache underneath the explanations. The fourth stage is the intrusive thoughts. Something around the 2-month mark tends to shift the quality of the avoidant's inner experience. By this point, the initial relief is long gone, the distractions are working less effectively, and thoughts of you begin arriving with a frequency and specificity that can no longer be fully managed. Not a general sense of missing someone, specific memories, the particular way you said something, the exact quality of a moment, the way things felt in a room when you were both in it, the texture of being known by someone who actually paid attention. These thoughts arrive uninvited. That's the part the avoidant finds most disorienting. They decided to let this go. They engineered the distance. They had reasons. And yet the mind that was supposed to be free keeps returning to the very thing it walked away from. The thoughts can't be argued with. They don't respond to rationalization. They just arrive, carrying their particular weight, and sit in the interior until they're ready to leave, which isn't always on the avoidant's schedule. For the avoidant who has not done significant internal work, this stage is experienced primarily as irritation. They're frustrated by the thoughts. They feel an urgency to suppress or redirect them. They may reach for more distractions, double down on the narrative that justified the distance, remind themselves of the things that felt hard. What they're less willing to do is ask why the thoughts keep coming. What they're resisting is the uncomfortable possibility that the thoughts are not intrusions at all, that they are, in fact, information. The information is this: what existed between you mattered enough to survive their leaving. That's not nothing. In the psychological economy of the avoidant, who has spent a lifetime carefully managing what they allow to register as important, this is actually significant. The fifth stage is comparison. The avoidant begins, consciously or not, measuring other people against you. This can happen in friendships, in new connections, in passing interactions. Someone doesn't understand a reference they would have understood. A conversation stays on the surface when they want it to go deeper. A person is kind in general, but not kind in the specific way that felt like being known by you. A warmth is present, but it doesn't have the quality of yours. This stage is a form of grief without the language of grief. It's the subterranean acknowledgement that what they had was particular, that it can't simply be replaced by something generically similar, that the person who offered it was not interchangeable with other people who might offer adjacent things. The avoidant, who may have once operated under the belief that closeness was closeness and people were more or less substitutable, begins to understand something they couldn't let themselves know when you were still close enough to flee from. Some people are irreplaceable. Some connections have a specific texture that no other connection can replicate. Some losses, even chosen ones, are real losses. That understanding is uncomfortable. It destabilizes the story that said the distance was the right choice. It refuses to be argued away by the reasons that felt sufficient at the time. The sixth stage is the quiet grief. Somewhere between 3 and 6 months, something settles into the avoidant that is less restlessness and more sorrow. It's quiet. It's not performed. Nobody sees it. The avoidant may barely have words for it, but there's a quality of sadness that arrives when the distractions are all exhausted and the interior is simply there, with the truth of what was lost in it. This is the grief that the avoidant has been outrunning since the moment the distance began. It arrives eventually because it was always there waiting, because what they walked away from was not nothing, because somewhere inside them, underneath all the mechanisms of self-protection, there was a person who felt the warmth of what you offered and let it matter more than they intended to. The avoidant in quiet grief does not necessarily look like someone grieving. They may seem fine. They may function well. They may seem more settled, actually, than they did during the restlessness phase. But the settling has a quality of resignation to it, a sense of having arrived at a truth they didn't want and can't change. The seventh stage is the exact moment of regret. This is what the title of this video points to. The moment doesn't arrive on a fixed schedule. For some avoidants, it crystallizes around the 3-month mark. For others, it takes 6 months or longer. For some, the ones most offended against their own interior, it may not arrive in any form they can put words to for much longer than that. But for those who had a real connection, and you did, it arrives. It arrives when the sum of all the previous stages can no longer be managed by the explanations they've been using, when the restlessness has lasted too long, when the intrusive thoughts have accumulated past a manageable threshold, when the comparisons have made it impossible to pretend what was lost was ordinary, when the quiet grief has been sitting with them long enough to be undeniable. The regret has a specific quality. It's not just the feeling of missing someone. It's the recognition that the missing is deserved, that the loss is self-authored, that the person who cared for them in the specific way that they are now experiencing the absence of, that person was not an obstacle to their peace. They were a gift that the avoidant's own fear could not receive. That recognition is a particular kind of pain. It requires the avoidant to turn toward their own role in the loss in a way that is fundamentally incompatible with the story that the distance was right. story cracks. The reasons that felt sufficient begin to feel like rationalizations. And somewhere in that crack, something that was very carefully protected starts to feel the cold. Here is the difficult truth about this stage. The regret doesn't always produce action. For many avoidants, the regret lives in the interior for a long time, sometimes indefinitely, without converting into the behavior you've been waiting for. This is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of avoidant attachment. A person can genuinely, deeply, privately regret losing you and still not be able to cross the gap between regret and repair. Because repair requires the same vulnerability that made them retreat in the first place. Regret, even real regret, doesn't dissolve the fear. The fear that getting close means getting hurt. The fear that wanting someone means becoming dependable on them. The fear that opening up creates exposure that the nervous system still, on some fundamental level, reads as dangerous. Regret does not automatically become readiness, and that distinction between genuine regret and genuine readiness is the one that matters most for you. What regret does do, even when it doesn't become action, is this. It makes the choice feel costly in a way it didn't before. It introduces a quality of weight to the silence that was absent in the relief stage. It makes the avoidant sit in something they can no longer neutralize with reasons, something that insists on being felt. That reckoning is not nothing. Even if it never reaches you, even if it never converts into the reach you've been hoping for, something happened in them, something real. The relationship you had was not invisible to them. It registered. It mattered enough to be felt in its absence. And the person who kept retreating from you is now sitting with the cost of that retreat in a way that cannot be avoided. You are allowed to know that. You are allowed to let it matter. But here is what has to come next. What the avoidant is doing in their process, whatever stage they're at, however long it takes, however real the regret eventually becomes, happens on their timeline, not yours. And you are not obligated to make yourself available at the end of that timeline. You are not required to hold your life in suspension, waiting to see what they decide to do with what they feel. No contact is often described as a tactic, a way to manufacture longing, a strategy to produce a specific outcome. But the version of no contact that actually serves you isn't strategic at all. It's the withdrawal of your attention and availability in order to rebuild something that was being slowly depleted. Your own groundedness, your own emotional regulation, your own capacity to feel at peace without constantly listening for whether they're going to come back. The healing that happens in no contact belongs to you. It is yours regardless of what happens on their side of the silence, regardless of whether they reach their moment of regret at 3 months or a year, regardless of whether that regret produces action or simply lives in them quietly, unspoken, unreached. What happens in the avoidant during no contact is real. The timeline is real. The regret, when it arrives, is real. But none of it is yours to manage or monitor or wait for. Your only work is your own interior. The version of you that gets to the other side of this, that has stopped organizing each day around whether they're coming back and started simply living, that version of you is worth becoming, regardless of the outcome on their end. Because the clarity you build in this period, the self-knowledge, the recovery of your own sense of who you are, outside of orienting yourself around someone who kept retreating, that is something that belongs to you permanently. It doesn't disappear if they come back. It doesn't disappear if they don't. Some avoidants do find their way to readiness. The timeline stretches, the regret deepens, the internal reckoning eventually becomes loud enough that something has to change. They begin the work. They come back different, not perfect, not without the old patterns surfacing from time to time, but genuinely trying to meet someone rather than perpetually preparing to leave. When that happens, It's recognizable, not because it's announced with fanfare, but because it has a different quality to it. The trying rather than the testing. The staying rather than the circling. Some don't. The regret stays in the interior. The walls stay up. The distance, which began as a choice, calcifies into a permanent way of being that protects them from having to risk anything real again. They carry what they walked away from like something that sits at the back of a room they try not to enter. Both are possible, and from where you are, you cannot know which one you're looking at. What you can know is where you are, what you're building in your own life, how you feel in the hours that aren't spent wondering about them, whether something is coming back online in you, some clarity, some appetite for your own future, some sense that the person you were before, the grief is still in there, waiting to be lived, that something is not small, that something is the whole point. The avoidant will arrive at their exact moment of regret on whatever timeline they arrive at it. That moment is real. It is coming, or it has already arrived, and is sitting in them without words, without a name, without a destination. And in that moment, everything you offered, the patience, the warmth, the genuine willingness to be known and to know someone, will be fully visible to them, fully felt. Perhaps for the first time without the anxiety of proximity distorting the seeing. What they do with that visibility is entirely theirs to decide. What you do with who you've become in the silence, that's yours. And who you're becoming is worth more than waiting for them to catch up. There's something worth exploring more carefully about the period between the avoidance moment of regret and whatever comes next. Because this is where the real shape of what they're capable of becomes visible. After the regret lands, after the avoidant has sat with the truth of what they walked away from, long enough that they can no longer avoid knowing it, a specific kind of internal conflict begins. On one side of that conflict is the pull toward you, the recognition of what was lost, the part of them that knows, without being able to argue its way out of knowing, that what existed between you was not ordinary and that they are poorer for its absence. On the other side is the fear that has governed their entire relational history, the same fear that produced the distance in the first place, the same nervous system response that says, getting close costs more than it gives, that opening up means becoming visible to pain, that wanting someone means becoming dependent on them, and dependency is a form of danger that the body still recognizes even when the logic no longer supports it. These two things sit in the avoidance simultaneously, the regret and the fear, the pull and the retreat. And how they navigate that tension, whether they turn toward it or away from it, will determine what comes next. The avoidants who turn toward it tend to do something specific. They start examining the pattern rather than just living in it. Not necessarily with a therapist, though that helps. Sometimes just with enough stillness to let the questions arrive. Why do I keep doing this? What am I actually afraid of? What happened inside me before I started pulling away? The questions don't all have clean answers, but the act of asking them is itself a departure from the pattern. It's the first sign that the architecture of avoidance is being interrogated rather than simply maintained. This internal examination is not linear. It doesn't produce permanent change overnight. It involves regression. It involves the old mechanisms firing, even while they're being examined. But it involves something new too, a quality of awareness that wasn't there before, a capacity to notice the retreat before it's already happened and ask what it was responding to. For the people who loved an avoidant, this process can be both hopeful and frustrating to witness, because it looks like forward movement, and then it looks like the old behavior again, and then it looks like forward movement again. The pattern doesn't disappear. It slowly, imperfectly, begins to loosen. And within that loosening, something becomes possible that wasn't before. But here's the thing, you're not watching this process. You're in no contact, which means the examination, if it's happening, is happening without you as the audience, without you as the recipient, without you holding the space for it. They are sitting with it alone, as they should be, because work that's done for the sake of getting someone back is qualitatively different from work that's done because the cost of the pattern has become undeniable. The version of change that lasts happens inside a person before it asks anything of the outside world. It doesn't begin with a reach toward you. It begins with a turning toward themselves. If that's happening, you'll know it eventually. Not by reading signs or calculating probabilities. You'll know it because the quality of any eventual reach will be different. It will have the weight of someone who has been somewhere uncomfortable and returned from it with something real to offer. Not a test, not reconnaissance. Something that has the texture of actual accountability, actual seeing of what happened between you and what role they played in it. That quality is not easy to fake, and its absence is equally unmistakable. There is something important to say about the particular grief that lives in no contact for the person who is left. Because this video is about the avoidance timeline, but you have a timeline too, and it runs parallel to theirs in your own interior with its own stages. You had the stage where hope kept you from fully feeling the loss, the stage where the hope started to cost you, the stage where you began, maybe reluctantly, maybe with significant resistance, to actually grieve. Not grieve the loss of them, exactly, though that too, but grieve the version of the future you had built around them, the specific shape of the life you had been imagining that had their presence in it. That grief is not small. It has the weight of something real because it was real. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't invent the meaning. You gave something genuine, and the fact that they couldn't receive it doesn't make what you gave worth less. It just means the return didn't match the investment. And that kind of asymmetry is one of the most quietly devastating things a person can experience. You are somewhere in your own timeline right now, and whatever stage you're at, whether you're still in the acute pain or somewhere in the longer, quieter stretch that comes after, it deserves to be honored, not prolonged beyond what serves you, but honored, allowed to be what it actually is. Because the people who come through this kind of grief intact, and you will come through it, tend to carry something with them afterward, a clarity about what they need and what they won't accept, a capacity for self-honoring that was built in the difficult months when they had to find their own ground because the person they were trying to build something with kept pulling theirs away. A quality of knowing what they're worth that didn't exist in the same form before. That's not a consolation prize. That's a real transformation, built in the hardest possible classroom. The avoidant will reach their exact moment of regret. The timeline is real. The stages are real. The quiet grief that eventually insists on being felt. That's real too. And somewhere in that interior experience, the shape of what they chose and what it cost becomes unmistakably clear to them. What they do with that clarity is something you may or may not ever witness. But what you do with yours, with the clarity you've been building in the silence, with the self-knowledge you've been accumulating in the months of not reaching, that is entirely yours to act on. Now, not when they come back, not when the timeline resolves. Now, the most important moment in this whole story is not the moment the avoidant regrets losing you. It's the moment you decide your life doesn't have to wait for that. There's a final thing about the avoidance timeline that deserves to be said directly. The stages described in this video are not a guarantee that the avoidant will return or that their regret will convert into meaningful action, or that the ending of your story will look the way you've hoped. The stages are real. The regret is real. But real feeling and chosen behavior are two different domains. And the avoidance history is specifically the history of someone who has difficulty crossing from one to the other. What the stages do tell you is something about the avoidance interior experience that tends to remain hidden, even from the people who know them well. The relief that isn't peace. The distractions that can't fully fill the space. The intrusive thoughts that refuse to be argued away. The comparisons that reveal the irreplaceability of what was lost. The quiet grief that settles in eventually, without announcement, in the stillness of a life that has everything except the particular thing that mattered. Understanding this is not the same as waiting for it to produce the outcome you want. Understanding it is about seeing clearly, without the distortion of idealization or resentment, what actually lives inside the person who created the distance. They are not indifferent. They are afraid. And fear, unlike indifference, is at least the raw material of change, even if that change never fully arrives. That distinction matters for how you carry this experience. If you carry it as evidence that you were simply not enough, that the avoidance retreat was a verdict on your value, you'll carry a wound that will follow you into the next relationship and the one after that. You'll bring the vigilance of someone who has been told, by the pattern of someone else's attachment, that being themselves is insufficient. If you carry it as the story of someone afraid who couldn't receive what was offered, which is the accurate version, you'll carry something different. Not a wound that says you were deficient, a knowledge that says you gave something real to someone who couldn't hold it, and that the inability to hold it was theirs, rooted in experiences that preceded you and have nothing to do with your worth. That knowledge is not comfort, exactly. Not in the way that having them come back and show up differently would be comfort, but it is the truth. And living inside the truth, even when it's painful, is less costly over time than living inside a story that distorts you. You are not too much. You are not too intense, too present, too attached, too needy in any way that reflects something broken in you. You are someone who wanted the closeness that you were offering. That is not a flaw. It is the basic human desire for connection, which is the correct desire to have. The avoidance fear was not a response to who you are specifically. It was a response to the closeness itself, the closeness that you were brave enough to offer, the closeness that they have not yet found the courage to receive. Their timeline continues. The regret is real. The stages are real. And somewhere along that timeline, in the quiet of a life they have organized around independence, the avoidant holds the knowledge of what they let go. Your timeline continues too. And what you build from here, grounded in what you know about yourself now, carrying the clarity that only this kind of loss can produce, is the more important story. Tend it accordingly.